Good morning.
Good morning.
And welcome to the Stephen Ministers session on the presence of grief throughout life with Pastor Jane Mackenzie. We are especially pleased to have Stephen ministers from Asbury United Methodist Church in Livermore, St. Anselm's Episcopal Church in Lafayette, and San Ramon Valley United Methodist Church in Alamo. They are among the churches which join us in training new Stephen ministers every few years, and we consider them good friends. Let us begin with an opening prayer by Irish theologian Padraig O'Tuama. Turning to the day and each other, we open ourselves to the day and each other. This is the day that the Lord has made, and a day we'll have to make our way through. Whether with ease or pain, with patience or joy, may we find opportunities for generosity towards others and ourselves. May we find moments of encounter even in isolation. May we find stories and memories even in the most complicated corners. May we start again where we have failed again. May we confess and be confessed to, because this is a way of living that's worth living daily. Amen. As some of you know, Jane Doty Mackenzie went to work for Chevron as a chemical engineer around 1980. She quickly rose through the ranks to a position which supported the CEO and executive committee on executive and leadership development, succession planning, and talent management for all employees. During this time, as a member of LOPC, she was in the class of 2003 of our Stephen Ministry training. In 2015, Jane discerned a call to formal ministry and entered Princeton Seminary, graduating with a master's in divinity in 2017, and then served for several years at First Presbyterian Church of Burlingame as associate pastor for community care, which also included supporting its Stephen Ministry program. She joined the staff of LOPC as a temporary pastor on January 16 of this year. Pastor Jane is well versed on where and how God is present in our lives, creating spaces in which individuals can worship in new ways, engage in spiritual practices, and listen for God's voice as we ask the big questions of life. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jane Mackenzie.
It's great to be here, and welcome to all of you from our sister churches. We're glad that you're able to join us this morning. And as I was listening to Liz in her comment about my quickly rising through the ranks, it wasn't at Chevron, it wasn't really that. It was a long and winding road, as many of you know who might work in the corporate world. And, I just thought that dealing with the subject of grief, whether it's our own or someone else's, is also a long and winding road. We meander through times in our lives when things seem to be going well, and we meander through times when we hit bumps in the road, experience some events in our lives that may cause us to grieve the loss of something. And usually when we think about loss, we think about loss of a loved one. But there are other kinds of grief that we experience throughout our lives, and it's those other kinds of grief that we're going to be focusing on today, because they're just as much a part of our life experience and just as much a part of who we become through God's grace and through God's transformation of what those events do in our lives and how they shape us. So I hope you are all ready for a journey in that regard today. I was leading a memorial service yesterday, and the selected text was from Ecclesiastes 3. And I thought that might be a good place for us to start today, because when we talk about grief, we often talk about seasons of grief, that there's time for grieving and there's time for laughing. And I want to make sure that even though this is going to be a pretty heavy morning, talking about grief, that we don't forget that there is always a lighter side to life as well. So listen to these words from Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And I love that those two are put side by side. A time to throw away stones, a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, always a good reminder for Stephen ministers, and a time to speak, always a good reminder for Stephen ministers, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Amen. So I do not consider myself to be a grief expert. I consider myself to be someone who's just had a lot of practical experience with grief, both in my own life and through accompanying other people in life. And I was driving over here today. I thought, I ride my bike a lot, and some people tend to call me a cyclist, but a cyclist in my mind is somebody who rides the Tour de France, right? And can do 150 miles a day. That's not me. So I think in terms of my grief expertise, I would call it the same as not riding the Tour de France and not being an expert in it, but certainly have had my own personal experience. But what I hope to do today is that we can all pull on the aggregate experience of all of you here in the room today. I'm indebted to a fellow pastor, Janet Bauer, who's a pastor over on the peninsula. She's a member at First Pres Burlingame, and some of the materials that I'm sharing today are materials that she and I partnered with to develop a 3-week class for people coming out of COVID who were really grieving the loss of a lot of things, and especially people who had had loved ones die and were not able to be with them during that time. And so just want to acknowledge Janet. She's a loving and gentle heart, and she has taught me quite a bit as well. So what I'd like to do for openers is I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I get us all engaged in some sort of common experience? And I am going to take us back to COVID, because as I think about something that all of us have experienced together, that was a time of loss for each and every one of us, that would be it. Now, however we experience that time is different. And on staff last week, we were talking about the fact that we still think that there's a huge overhang of COVID in our society. Our junior hires and senior hires here seem to be especially impacted because they lost so many critical years of schooling with their peers. I was reading in the paper today of USC grads who are not going to be able to have their graduation ceremony, and they're also the group of students who did not have high school graduation ceremonies because of COVID. So even though, for some of us it may feel like it's a lot in the distance, we still as a society are dealing with COVID, and our losses during that time period are a really good example of the first type of grief that we're going to be talking about. So what I'd like you to do, I've got a video that's just no talking, is just music and the empty streets of San Francisco during that first couple of weeks of COVID. And as you're watching, what I'd like you to do is there's some small pieces of paper that are about this size on your table. I'd like you to grab, 1, 2, 3 of those. And as you're watching the video and reflecting on your own experience during kind of 2020, 2021, perhaps even now, to just write down 1 or 2 words of something that you felt like was a loss for you during that time period. And we're going to come back and revisit that a little bit later this morning. But I wanted to start us with something that every single one of us have experienced and thought that would be a good thing to do. So if you would, just maybe jot down one thing per piece of paper that was kind of a memory that may have stirred for you of something that perhaps was a loss for you during that time period. And then just set that aside. Okay. All right. So before we go any further, I want to make sure that we're caring for ourselves today. Because some of the things that may come up in this room may touch on some grief that you've experienced in your life. So I just want you to know where you have resources available to you. We have a list of local therapists, psychologists in the area that have been vetted by Jamie Polson, available to share with you if that is needed, or for anyone you're seeing as a Stephen minister. But what I would like you to do is also to take time and in your notes to just write down the names of 3 to 5 people that you could call or talk to if you needed somebody yourself to talk to. I refer to these people as my 3 a.m. friends. They are my friends who I could call at 3 a.m. and I know that they would answer the phone and get out of bed and spend some time with me. So just jot down a few names of people just to trigger your own mind. I'll try to remember to refer you to the page in the handout that we'll be talking about as we go along. If you get lost, just call out, tell me you need to know where we are, and I'll help you out. But first thought we would spend some time just doing a really light brush on kind of some theories of grief in general. And I'm assuming that some of this will be review for quite a few of you. And when we think about theories of grief, usually the one that comes up first is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. She had done some work with people who were terminally ill and developed this model, right, of the stages of grief. And one of our misconceptions, kind of as a society, is that because we have these stages of grief and we may think linearly, we think that we go from the first one to the second one to the third one to the fourth one to the fifth one, and then we're done and all is good. Right? But what we know is that, people bounce around from stage to stage, and it is much more fluid than what she had originally depicted. So there's some value in thinking about this because we can recognize where we are, where someone we're accompanying as a Stephen minister, is, and being able to just name it, right? They may be experiencing a lot of anger or denial, and just being able to normalize that and name it as a part of the grieving process can be extremely helpful to people. A guy named David Kessler did some work with her, and he added a 6th component, or a 6th stage, which I actually love as a person of faith, and that is the stage of meaning. Because I personally believe that there can be meaning found or in every single experience of grief that we experience. And if that meaning is an assurance that God is always with us, there is meaning in that alone. But often people who go through a period of grief use that as a launching pad for something else in their lives. I have a dear friend, a consultant that I used to work with, who gave birth to a child who did not have like the 3 main parts of her brain that allow you to breathe naturally, and so she was in the NICU for a while, and then they obviously pulled her off of life support, and she died in Leslie's arms. And from that, and she happened to be born on Christmas Eve. And every year since then, Leslie and her husband have cooked dinner and taken it over to all the moms and the staff that are working in the NICU at the hospital as her way of giving back. And so I use that as an example of way that people can find meaning out of some pretty significant periods of life. And, that meaning is what we create out of the chaos that can ensue once we experience some grief. Warden has a theory of grief that really looks at the tasks. And as a type AAA person, I'm not just a type A, I'm a type AAA. I kind of rebel against this, which is really weird because all I need to do is say, just like, tell me what I need to do, I'll do it and I'll get on it, right? So thinking about the grieving process as a task, there's something in me that rebels against that. But there are some, certain steps that he has proposed about just accepting the reality of the loss, working through the pain, adjusting to the environment. And a lot of these grief theories are developed with, the death of a loved one. And then, finding some enduring connection to that loved one. My example of my friend Leslie may be an example of that, where she developed an enduring connection to her daughter, Sydney, through her acts of service to others. And then Robert Niemeyer has lately come back to this concept of meaning. Just come on in and grab a seat anywhere you want. That grief is we view it as a disruption in our life, and it's something that kind of takes our lives out of order. But that from that we can reconstruct a world of meaning. And basically we have to adapt. I mean, there's no changing the event that has occurred, but it becomes incorporated into our life story. And so somehow that can be the foundation for a change in how we view ourselves, how we view the world, how we experience God. But there's a larger story that we can construct out of periods of grief. And Niemeyer actually says that he calls this the reconstruction of a world of meaning, may be a more helpful paradigm for understanding grief than the passive endurance of stages, which I find, as I say, as a person of faith, I find that a lot more meaningful, all puns intended, of a way of looking at grief. And I want to make sure that we just stay grounded in our source here today, because in 1 Thessalonians 4, we read that where it says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." And I think that's what distinguishes us in terms of the grief that we experience, is that we believe that that God is in all things, and that there is the ability to find some resurrection, whether not full resurrection as in Jesus on Easter morning, but there is some way to find resurrection out of those places that may feel like little mini deaths or large deaths to us. That there is always the hope that something good can come out of that. And if not in our lifetime, certainly in our life after this one. But we are propelled forward by hope. And that's what I think one of the major things that distinguishes us, as people of faith, is that we have something that always propels us forward and keeps us forward looking. And our hope is that God can transform any experience of grief into something of meaning. So a couple other things I just want to highlight on quickly, that as you're meeting with people, as you're meeting with your care receivers, there's a whole litany of things that can be symptoms of grief that we may not even associate with that. And so whether you're experiencing it or you see somebody that you're caregiver for may experience some of these things and be signs that there's some underlying grief there that they may not have been ready to talk about or have talked about yet. And it's just things like isolating yourself from others, loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping. Often use of drugs or alcohol could be a symptom that there's something that may require some more intensive attention, thoughts of death or suicide, crying spells, any change in the usual behavior. And this is kind of where I say, as a pastor, I can go partway there with people, but I am not a trained therapist. And I think it's always important for us to know where our own personal boundaries are, and what we're qualified to do and what we're not qualified to do. So as we're dealing with people, being conscious, right, of where our training can take us and how far it can take us, but always being ready to refer someone out if you see any signs that these, of these signs, that they may need some more qualified or more intensive support. And then just kind of another kind of quick grounding is that grief, it shows up in all kinds of different ways. If you look at this chart, it's helpful for me. I kind of, as Liz says, I'm an engineer by training, so graphs and pictures and Venn diagrams speak to me. If this doesn't speak to you, don't worry about it. But there are all of these overlapping areas that where we experience grief, right? So we may think about grief being something physical. It may just be tears that are shed, but it may actually be the pit in the stomach. It may be the lack of sleep. It may be other things that show up as a symptom of grief. Social, someone may isolate themselves, have difficulty re-engaging in normal life, may have some family issues that have come up as a result of what they've experienced. Psychological, this is, kind of things that may be touching on prior griefs, things that may be touching on some trauma that they've experienced. Anything in that realm, I certainly am not qualified to help someone go deeper in, and that's certainly where I'd look at referring someone out. And then spiritual, and I think that's a place all of us play with people. Just the simple act of being able to pray with someone, to ask a question, where might God be in this situation? How might God be showing up in your life? Where do you feel like God has abandoned you? Those are certainly questions that we can sit with people on and ask if we're sensing that there may be some spiritual aspects to the grief that they're experiencing. So today we're going to talk about 3 different distinct types of grief. We're going to talk about disenfranchised grief, ambiguous grief, and anticipatory grief. And often when people are feeling grief, their questions come up in terms of, how do I move forward from here? What do I do? How will the after be different than the before? And how different will my life be because I have experienced this particular grief? I will say that, my experience is that we hold very little space for grief as a culture. As I said, I had a memorial service here yesterday, and, in a sense, knowing that is often a mark of closure for the spouse of the person who has died, because it's a public event, people surround. But always I'm reminded that the grief does not stop after that event. But most of the people that were here yesterday will probably continue to go on with their lives, and that's not a negative statement about them. But we will continue to grieve, and there's no timeline on grief, right? There's no set process, there's no set path through grief. But I don't think as a society that we really hold enough space or create enough space for people who grieve. I was, as part of my one of my seminary classes was in Israel, actually studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one of the things that really struck me was as you stand at the foot of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the temple walls are still there. Our guide told us that as people came into the temple to worship, there were 2 doors. There was a door, big stairway that went up to the internal plaza, and there was a stairway that came down. But if you were in your first year of having lost someone in your family to death, you went up the exit door. Because that way, every single person who was worshiping would be able to greet you in your grief on their way out as you were going in. And I just thought, what a beautiful thing. That we don't have traditions like that in our society. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is how do we help people create rituals out of some of the things that they have lost in their lives. So let's launch into disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is basically what most of us felt during COVID, because it's a type of loss that really isn't given the status of having lost a loved one to death. It's a type of grief that we think we may cast away and say, you know what, this isn't as important of a grief as someone else is experiencing, so we might want to minimize it. And it's our own grief. Our grief is our grief, and we should never minimize what it is that we are experiencing. And mental health experts acknowledge that it's important for us to acknowledge loss of all types in our lives. And so this concept of disenfranchised grief is really something that can impact us greatly. But we may not even share it with friends. We may not even, talk to others about it. We may not even recognize it as a source of grief or loss, but it's real. So these are the types of things, and I'm now on slide 6 in your handouts. Types of disenfranchised losses. So they're things like retirement. Retirement is a time we all look forward to, and yet when we get there, there's a loss of who we used to be, right? So there's a loss of identity. There perhaps might be a loss of community, a loss of friendships, people that we were bumping into regularly through our work. And so someone retiring may have a lot that they're looking forward to, but there's also some things that they're leaving behind. Loss of a pet is a good example. I was out walking our dog the other day and just happened to start up a conversation with a woman on the trail who told me that she was out walking a neighbor's dog because she had put her dog down recently, very early. I think it was had lived for maybe 5 years, and because she didn't feel like there was anybody who could understand that. She actually went and got trained to be a pet grief therapist. And I thought, an example of taking someone's grief, right, and turning it into something good. Loss of a job, loss of income, certainly a divorce, loss of youth. I'm certainly feeling that now as, I wake up in the morning and if where I hurt this morning is different than where I hurt yesterday, it's a good day. Loss of identity, any change in our daily routine can be, can bring up some grief for an individual. And so these are the types of things that are disenfranchised grief. And on there's a lot of emotions that can there's a lot of emotions that can accompany disenfranchised grief. I've got those listed here. Things like sadness, relief can be one, anger, separation anxiety, irritability, remorse, sorrow, regret. Lots of words that can come up as we're thinking about a loss that we have experienced. I referenced David Kessler earlier, who kind of added the sixth piece to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Grief, meaning this stage of meaning. I love this quote of his, that emotions need motion. They need someplace to go. We tell ourselves things like, I feel sad, but I shouldn't feel that. Other people have it worse. We should stop at the first feeling. I feel sad. Let me go for 5 minutes and feel sad. Our work is to feel our sadness and fear and anger, whether or not someone else is feeling something. Fighting it doesn't help because your body is producing the feeling. If we allow the feelings to happen, they'll happen in an orderly way, and it empowers us. Then we're not victims. And I just love this concept of emotions needing a place to go, and being able to express them helps us to move forward. And I actually think that that's one of the things that all of you as Stephen ministers do, that this is kind of Jane's theory. I got no data to back this up. But I think when we talk about things and actually are able to externalize it, just by getting those words out of our mouths and putting them out there lightens the burden for someone. Just being able to say, I'm anxious, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I really miss so-and-so, I am struggling. All of that, being able to share it, and I think in a very real way, that's how we help to accompany someone through a time of grieving, by listening to them and being able to allow them to get it out, because it puts those emotions into motion and then allows them perhaps to think about moving forward and what that might be. So grief is, it's a normal part of life. I don't think in that list of disenfranchised losses, there's probably at least one thing on that list that you all have experienced in your life. We all grieve things. We all grieve things differently at our own pace, in our own way. And it's really an experience of holding on and being forced to let go of something that we didn't want to let go of. I think that's often at the root of grief. And healing, when it comes, is not necessarily a fixing it, right? The thing that has been lost or that we have let go of has been lost. It's behind us. But ultimately, our prayer is that we get to a place of peace or wholeness. The word shalom in Hebrew actually, we often translate it as peace, but what it really means is wholeness, well-being, right? That we are, again, feeling like we are in a place of having been made whole and having whatever it is that we have lost and the feelings associated with that incorporated into who we are and incorporated into our own story. So this is where I'm going to get you talking. I'm going to ask you to, around your tables, spend some time processing whatever it is you wrote on your little piece of paper about whatever your experience was during COVID. And if you look at the top of page 7, I've just put some questions, some prompt questions for you. And I'm actually going to give you a half hour to do this. So I want you to, not go lightly, but to just share your stories with each other. And so, what would be you don't need to answer all of these, just, pick one or two that might speak to you. What would be the brief story of your personal experience of the pandemic? What's your very first memory? Like, when did the pandemic become real for you? For me, it was sitting in the upper room, yes, we called it that, over at Burlingame Presbyterian in a staff meeting when we got the news that Gavin Newsom was, shutting things down that night. And I got to preach the first sermon on video that Sunday. So that's when it became very real for me, preaching to a completely empty sanctuary. That was a rather otherworldly experience. So what event made it real for you? What made the deepest or most lasting impression on you? Have you been able to find any meaning in that experience? Has something come out of that for you, either some understanding of the importance of something in your life, how God may have been present in the moment, how it may have shifted your relationship to others. And then, are there things that you still need to grieve? And I do think that that's an important question for us to still ask. Technically the pandemic's been over for a couple of years, but as I said earlier, there are still things that perhaps you may need to grieve. So I'm going to give you a half hour to do that, but I'm going to jump ahead a bit in the content because I'm going to help us ritualize or put together a ritual around that at the end of your conversations. So steps to take to grieve our losses, again on page 7, is first to name the loss. Second is to seek support and share it with others. A third way to grieve a disenfranchised grief is to create a ritual around that. And then perhaps help someone else. One of the things I've learned in my short time of being a pastor is that if I'm meeting with someone who seems to be stuck in their grief, often I will find a way for them to do something for someone else. Whether it's just coming in early and helping set up tables, or just something that helps them do something for others to help them get unstuck. And finding just small moments of enjoyment. And it may just be taking a 5-minute walk outside. It may be reading a book, but trying to encourage them to find some way to find a source of enjoyment in life. So maybe some of those things are things that were part of your experience as you went through COVID. So, those are the things that are on page 7. And so I'm going to invite you now into your just small groups, and the two of you can come and join a table. You don't need to sit back in the corner. You've got till 10 o'clock. And I would like you to just spend some time talking to each other about what it is you wrote down on your small pieces of paper, and then we'll gather back together at 10 o'clock. Okay, I'm going to call us back together. All right, it didn't seem like any of you were at a loss for words or stories in your time together. Thank you for being willing to revisit that, and I hope you found some common threads, perhaps some reflection, because I do think it's a good thing at times to reflect on the events in our lives. We're about to go into a break. For those of you who are not regular attendees here, there are some restrooms right behind this wall if you need those, and there's coffee and lots of things to keep you fueled up for the rest of our session together. And before we do that, I'm a collector of poems, poetry. I am not a poet. Maybe that's why I collect other people's words. So often when I'm teaching, I'll introduce some things that have been meaningful to me or have spoken specifically to a topic that we're covering. And so I'd like to close this time on disenfranchised grief with a poem by Khalil Gibran called "The River." Because I think it really speaks to this concept of how everything we experience in life, the losses that we experience, flow into our story. They flow into who we are, and our story is always part of a bigger story. So he writes, "It is said before entering the sea, a river trembles with fear. She looks back at the path she has traveled, from the peaks of the mountains, the long winding road crossing forests and villages. And in front of her, she sees an ocean so vast that to enter there seems nothing more than to disappear forever. But there is no other way. The river cannot go back. Nobody can go back. To go back is impossible in existence. The river needs to take the risk of entering the ocean, because only then will fear disappear. Because that's where the river will know it's not about disappearing into the ocean, but of becoming the ocean." And I just love that. So something you can share with others as you may be moved. So when I talked about the kind of how we address disenfranchised grief, I've talked about naming the loss, which is what we've done around the table, seeking the support or asking others to listen to our stories, creating a ritual, and that's what I'm going to give you an example of now, and then helping someone else and finding some small moments of enjoyment. So I think, just in your listening to each other's stories, you have helped each other, and we're going to have a moment of enjoyment by getting some coffee and some treats afterwards. But the ritual part of this is Claudia. I've been bringing Claudia to the class that I'm teaching on Wednesday nights. And the story behind Claudia is my husband and my daughters, when they were very young, went to an art show, and we wandered past this booth at the art show. And, we all kind of thought she was kind of cool. And then we wandered around for an hour, and my younger daughter, who was probably about 4 at the time, said, I think we need to go back and take that lady home with us. So we wandered back over to where this artist stall was, and on the way over, Meg said, and her name is going to be Claudia. I have no clue who Claudia was in her life, but Claudia became Claudia. So we showed up at the booth, and fortunately, she was still there, and we told the woman there that we would like to purchase Claudia. And it turned out that this woman was there selling the remaining pieces of her husband's art, that he had died in the year prior to that. And Meg, cute little Meg at 4, said, her name is Claudia. And this woman just started to cry. This woman just started to cry, because her name was Claudia. And so, and I share this story just because we never know how we're going to touch somebody else at a time of grief in a way that's going to be meaningful to them. But just, listening, showing up, being present with others is often, and can be an unexpected gift to them. So Claudia's bowl is filled with water. All the little pieces of paper that you wrote down, the things that you had lost during COVID, are actually on something called spy paper, which is soluble in water. So I'm going to invite you that if whatever you wrote down is something that you have either been able to transform into something of meaning, whether you're able to let go of it, or if you're able to say, you know what, this is in my past, I have moved forward, and I am just ready, to release this in some ritualistic way. As we go into our break, I invite you to just come and just drop your pieces of paper in the water, and they will dissolve away, and all of ours will then be kind of a collective letting go of that. And if what you're dealing with is still something that you're processing, hang on to your piece of paper. This is not, it's not a requirement, but I'll just, I think often doing something, which is why I think memorial services are important, even still, that, because it's a marker of time. And it may not mean that the grief is done, but it's a marker of time that we're, doing something, a ritual together as a community that enables us to move forward. So I will just invite you to do that, and then we will gather again in about 10 minutes. So come visit Claudia, grab some coffee, grab some snacks, use the restrooms, whatever you need. Stretch your body, go out and enjoy the fresh air, and we'll regather why don't we regather at 20 after? All right, lots of great conversation going on. All right, so we're going to make a shift now to talking about 2 other types of grief. First one is ambiguous loss. And I love this statue. It's from Geneva, Switzerland. It was created by an artist who was trying to depict what it felt like after the death of his wife. But I also love this because I just think when we experience ambiguous loss, there is a hole there that just isn't ever going to be filled, because that's where the ambiguity comes in. So ambiguous loss is the type of loss that we experience when there isn't any closure. And it leaves us asking a lot of open questions, right? It's the type of loss that might be felt it is the type of loss that's felt by a woman I know whose son was sailing, went out under the Golden Gate Bridge and never came back, right? So raising all kinds of questions. It really complicates the grieving process because there isn't that sense of being able to know for sure. what happened, and often that type of grief remains unresolved. And I think that this is probably the most difficult type of grief to deal with, because it's often something that there aren't a lot of other people, right, around us who can say that they've experienced the same thing. So it's typically kind of comes in two different types. One is when the person is present but psychologically absent. So this is the ambiguous loss associated with someone who may have Alzheimer's or late stage dementia, because the person is there, and we really are wondering what their experience is, right? Because they're no longer able to necessarily represent themselves. My dad had a sister who, looking back, I think was probably agoraphobic. She had something traumatic happen in her life and rarely left her apartment in Manhattan. Was fortunately befriended by a man who took care of her and ended up, when she developed some sort of cognitive decline at the end of her life, made sure that she was put into a memory care facility and actually paid for her to be there. I mean, the man was a saint. And it had been a totally platonic relationship. And my dad, I was going to New York on a family vacation, and my dad said, "Could you just walk by the place where Aunt Mary is and just let me know that she's in an okay place? You know, that it looks like it's decent and she's being treated well." So we went, and I actually went in and asked if I could see her. And so I went in, and there's something happened between she and my grandmother that totally split their relationship, and nobody in the family knows what it was. And I have always wanted to know what that was. And so we went to see her, and whatever cognitive difficulty she was having, I introduced myself. She said, "Yes, I have a brother." I said, "Yes, his name is Don. I'm his daughter, Jane." And so she had enough wit about her to know that she had a brother named Don. But every sentence that she spoke started like here, and the back end of the sentence was a completely different topic. So verbally, there was nothing that she could piece together. And I almost felt like if I could have had, this is like my lingering question, if I could have had a month of just visiting her every day, that I might have been able to piece together, the two bits of the questions and figure it out. Because it is, to this day, it's there was something very tragic that happened between she and my grandmother, and none of us to this day know what it is. So for me, that's the type of thing that's an ambiguous loss, because I don't know what it was. And both she and my grandmother suffered for years because of their broken relationship. The other type of ambiguous loss is when a person is physically absent but psychologically present, right? So this is a case where you may have someone who's been kidnapped, someone who's left a suicide note, and you don't know whether they have carried out on it or not. Someone who, that there's, likely been a murder, but the body is not absent. So these are the types of losses that people experience when there are just an incredible number of open questions at the end. So some examples are, a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, which often raises all kinds of questions about, I coulda, shoulda, woulda, if I'd known differently, could I have caught this earlier? Just ambiguous because you don't know whether there's anything that could have stemmed it, or because you don't know what the prognosis is going to be later on. A pending divorce, right? If one member of the marriage is hoping to be reconciled, right? Will my spouse ever want to be reconciled to me? And so kind of during that period, that can be an ambiguous loss. Or a chronic illness where, you just don't know, right, what the long-term prognosis is. And so you live with this state of unknowing. And I think that, again, this type of loss is often something that benefits from the type of care that you all provide. There have been some really interesting studies done recently on PTSD that if people are able to talk about their experience shortly after whatever the traumatic experience is, it actually helps to prevent them from experiencing long-term post-traumatic stress disorder. Because, as I said earlier, they're able to get it out. I was reading one study that actually posited, and I don't know how you prove this, but that, there was a lot more PTSD coming out of the Vietnam War than there was out of World War I or World War II. And the reason that the psychologist was thinking that was the case was because in World War I and World War II, the troops all had to march from wherever they were to the nearest port to get on a ship and take a long journey home. And during that march and during that walk, they were able to share their experiences with each other. And so they were able to find community. They were able to talk about what their shared experience had been and get it externalized. Where with the Vietnam War, they got on a plane and flew home and went home. And the people who were home, receiving them in, had no clue what had happened to them, and so they weren't able to talk about their experience. So this is a case where I can't stand here today and say I've got any guidance on how to support someone who is dealing with ambiguous loss, other than just allowing them to share their experience and what they're going through, and then making sure that if they have a need for it, that they do get some very intense psychological counseling for that, because I think this is the most complicated, most difficult type of grief to deal with, and I just wanted to make you all aware of it, that it's this whole branch of grief in and of itself. So next we're going to talk about anticipatory grief. And anticipatory grief is I think what a lot of the Psalms are about, to be quite honest with you. If we read through the Psalms in the Bible, a full third of them are Psalms of lament. Meaning, and the Psalms of Lament have a very similar pattern to them. They start with someone giving praise to God and saying, I know you're God on high, God, you created the heavens and the earth. And then the middle part of the lament is usually my enemy's about to get me. They're hiding behind the crag. They're just over the hill. I have an affliction that feels like I'm being pierced with arrows. My bed is a bed of tears every night. And all of the middle parts of the Psalms are a lot of expressions of anticipatory grief, that something is either present and they're not sure whether it's going to go away, or that there's some anxiety about something that's about to happen. And then in 98% of the Psalms of Lament, they then turn to a place of, but I remember, God, who you are. And I know you will be with me. I know you will protect me. And I know that you are still God. And I think that's just such a beautiful, image for how we find our own way through grief. And so the questions that get raised in the Psalms are, why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Wake up, God, are you sleeping? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And, even Jesus on the cross, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me, out of Psalm 22. So I've given you Psalm 42 because it in itself is a psalm of lament. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng, how I led them in the procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. That's what grief feels like the billows of the waves are flowing over. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me while they say to me continually, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. So you can see, just the vacillations in this psalm that speak about what this, what grief feels like, and this sense of being underwater, sense of being ill, having, tears for food day and night. I love the Psalms because they are just so, they're just human. They just express the full range of our human emotions. And even at the end, though, there is still this hope in my God. And that's the thing that always continues to pull us forward. So what is anticipatory grief? Anticipatory grief, and I'm on page 16 in your handouts, is the distress we feel because of something that may happen in the future. Something that we may feel months or even years before our own death or the death of a loved one, or just knowing that some loss is pending. It's different than conventional grief, because conventional grief, grieving over the death of a loved one, is grieving an event that has happened in the past. Anticipatory grief is grieving something that may or may not happen in the future. Likely will, but there's a difference. There's a difference there, because there's a sense of not quite being able to move forward, to move beyond, because with anticipatory grief, you're going deeper into whatever it is that is the source of that grief. And even though, with a chronic illness, stage 4 cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's, we know where the likely end is going to be. All is not lost. There is still hope, and that's what I kind of hope we can get out of our time together, just in terms of how do you sit with someone who's dealing with some anticipatory grief. So, who can experience anticipatory grief is anyone. The person who has the pending loss, the family members, the friends. With my husband is the type of person who just doesn't stress. So if something were to happen to him and he were to develop some chronic illness, he would probably be fine with it. I would not be, right? Because I tend to worry and get anxious about things a lot more than he does. And so a lot of it is based on our personal approach to life, but it can impact anyone in the entire family system, from spouses, sisters, brothers, parents, children, and friends. So what are some examples of anticipatory grief? So I've talked about a chronic illness, a diagnosis of something like Alzheimer's or dementia. Preparing for an empty nest, some of you may be on the verge of that or going through that. That's an anticipatory grief. My mom started crying 3 weeks before I went off to college. She just did, and I thought that was really weird. And then I started crying before my kids went off to college and thought, okay, this is genetic. Divorce, end-of-life care, caring for children who have a chronic or a terminal illness, a new job or a new relationship or a geographic change can prompt some anticipatory grief if you know you're going to be leaving something behind. Pregnancy complications certainly can be a lot of anticipatory grief with that. If you know you're carrying a child who has already been diagnosed, perhaps with some health issues that are going to need to be attended to after birth. So there's a whole laundry list of things that can prompt someone to experience anticipatory grief. And what you might feel, kind of those emotions that need motion, like I said earlier, a lot of the same emotions that come up with any type of grief, just sadness, irritability, anxiety, denial. Guilt can be associated with anticipatory grief in some ways, just because the person may see that there was something that they have done that has caused this particular path to be present in their lives. Loneliness, tearfulness, kind of the typical things that we associate with any sort of grief event, maybe what individuals will feel during anticipatory grief. So what might be likely for someone to either voice or experience during this time period? So it could be that the person's, accepting that the loss is inevitable, right? It could be that they're just going to, they may say, my life is over now, even though they still have plenty of years ahead of them. Someone may feel concern for the person who is experiencing whatever the anticipatory loss is, and they may have some concerns over relationships that have been damaged in the past. So one of the good things about, if I can call it that, one of the good things about anticipatory grief is that it allows you to perhaps patch up relationships with someone, because you know that time is going to be present and may not be present later on. Jamie Polson went to visit one of our congregation members who was on hospice, and the two of them had a beautiful 2-hour conversation about some things that were heavy on this woman's heart recently, and she just needed someone to listen to kind of help bring that healing about. So in a sense, it can be a trigger for someone to make amends in their lives. And, we see that probably more often than we might expect as someone kind of faces something that they're dealing with directly. They can rehearse the loss, focus on funeral arrangements or saying goodbye. This memorial service, Jan Brown was there. Where are you sitting, Jan? She's back there. She was at this memorial service yesterday, and the man who had died was not part of our congregation, but he had planned his own memorial service. He was a lover of classical music, and so Brianna and Alex Bonner sang some beautiful, pieces. The music was stellar. Joyce Lee played, and and it was just such a gift to his wife to basically say, here's what I want my own memorial service to be, because he had time to plan. And we were both just commenting, musically, it was one of the most beautiful memorial services we've ever been. I had tears gushing. It's a good thing my back was to the congregation at that point in time, because the music was just beautiful. They can imagine the future, right? They can start to project forward, and often this is a place where people go immediately, as I experience it in talking to people when they've been diagnosed with with cancer perhaps. And it's not so much the loss of their own lives as it is leaving people behind. It's I won't be present for my daughter's wedding, I won't be present when my granddaughter is born, and so it's the loss of leaving people behind that needs to be expressed and thought about, and perhaps finding some creative ways to be present even though they may not physically be present for those events. And then it's obviously a time when people may may start talking about what happens after death. And as a pastor, I can stand up here and tell you, I don't have a clue. I have a hope, but I'm not sure. And so it may just be that it invites people into a time of thinking about what is it that you experience as we transition from this life to the next. What I do know, I know from experience that there's been a lot of research done lately about people who have visions, end-of-life visions, and see family members who have passed along before them. I don't know, Sharon Campton, some of you may know, works as a hospice chaplain. She and I have talked about this, about experiences where there are people present in the room who are very real to people. And she and I have both had that in being with people who are near the end of life. And I don't doubt that happens at all. And I also, but I don't know what exactly happens, as we transition into the next life. I don't know what that experience will be like, for sure. And I know I have hopes of what it will be like, but it may be an opportunity for somebody just to engage in some, what would they dream? What would their prayer be that would be like for them? Who do they need to speak with? Who do they need to close the loop with on some important things in their life? Good questions to ask. So let me just kind of pause, and in addition to the kind of list of things that I've given you, have any of you, either in your own lives or in your Stephen ministry, kind of accompanied people or dealt with this type of grief? Kind of what's been your own personal experience? Can you name it?
Oh,
Yeah. I mean, you're nodding your head, so I'm assuming that was a yes?
I don't know that I can name it. When my mother was in the process of dying, she said to me, I went to visit her, and she said to me, Jesus was here today. And I had requested a minister from LOPC to visit her. And like a fool, I didn't ask the question or questions. What did you say to him? What did he look like? Or or anything like that would be revealing. I took it that she thought that the minister who came to visit was Jesus. And as I look back on this, I mean, we're going back to the 1970s, and she saw Jesus. And I regret that I did not ask questions that would give me more solid answers.
Interesting. And affirm her experience, but also so you could recognize Jesus when he was walking down the street, perhaps. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
There's a hand over here.
There's a hand over. Oh, call me.
When I was working, I went to care facilities where seniors live, and there was this one lady, and I went in there and talked to her, and she says, "Well, last night I went to Paradise, and I'm going back to Paradise on, what was it, June?" She said a date, and then I went in, and I came back the next time, and they said, "Well, she passed away," and it was the day that she said, the nurse, and she couldn't have taken her own, her own, she was in a care facility, so she was watched and stuff, and that was the day to her, I'm sure she expected to be in paradise that day, and she was.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in thin places. I don't know if you're familiar with that term at all. Presbyterians derive from, Celtic Christianity, and the Celts have this concept of thin places where heaven and earth touch. And it's often at places like a threshold or where the water hits the coast of a of a lake, or the ocean, or where the sky meets the horizon, that there are these thin places where heaven touches earth. And I think as someone is drawing close to death, I think they are living in a thin place, and the border between heaven and earth gets really thin in that space. And anyway, I don't know how to explain it other than that, but yeah, people have a pretty good premonition at times. Yes.
I spent a lot of time with my grandmother in her last few years, and I remember the family finally showing up when she was on her deathbed in the hospital, and I showed up. I mean, I already said my goodbyes, so I showed up at 3:30, and the last thing she said was, "Guys, let me go. Jesus is waiting for me."
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. She knew.
So
She knew.
She was that.
Yeah. And also gave you some comfort and assurance as well.
I had already said my goodbyes, but it did help me. And
Yeah.
I think they helped the family also.
Yeah, great.
And she did that as a last loving act, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, her
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So there's on page 19, talking a bit about we got to recognize that there's some things that we can't change in life, right? So there's 5 things we can't change. There's only 5. there's only 5. Yeah. I maybe 6. My puppy has turned into a pyromaniac by chewing on electrical wires, but maybe that's the 6th thing. But all right, so the first thing is that everything changes and ends, right? Every day the cells in our body are being recreated. I mean, the substance of life, everything changes and ends. Things do not always go according to plan. If you are someone who has always had things go according to plan, I would love to talk to you and figure out, kind of how you're planning to make sure the plans go according to plan. Life is not ever fair, and that's a hard one to accept. But life is not fair, and certainly we can look around our world today and know that there's just a lot of injustice, a lot of things that don't seem fair in terms of human interaction with human interaction, but also just in terms of, when a 5-year-old, is going through cancer treatment. It just is never fair. Pain is a part of life. We were all born as part of a pain process. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Our mothers were in pain when they delivered us. So we kind of enter this world, having pain be part of our own life process. And people are not loving and loyal all the time. Okay, any disagreements with those 5 things we cannot change? People are human. All right. But for each of these, there is some way that we can reframe our experience, right? And so rather than being stuck, we can look and see where the opportunity for growth or meaning might be in what is happening. So although everything changes and ends, things renew themselves and move through cycles that further evolution or further, spring to me is a resurrection period. Not that Easter happens in the spring, but, the dirt is dead. The dirt, when it springs rain, actually starts to emit smells, right? Scientifically, dirt releases some chemicals that give that spring smell. The dirt comes to life. Okay, it's not just the flowers, it's the dirt that is coming to life. And if we can look at something like dirt and say this was dead, right, and know that there's some microorganisms in that are helping to then create life, we can look at ourselves as organisms that have the potential, again, to be reborn, to be resurrected, to have the experiences in our lives where we do find meaning, to become resurrection experiences for us. Although things do not always go to plan, we sometimes sense a larger plan at work through synchronicity that opens startling possibilities. I can say that I am here today because of some person I never met. So my husband was in the Navy when we got married. We were living down in we had met here at First Pres Berkeley. We were living down in LA. He needed to serve one more year in the Navy. He's a dentist, and we wanted to be back up here in the Bay Area. Neither of us grew up in California, but we felt like this was home. And he asked to be transferred back up here, and the billet officer said, "You're crazy. All the positions in the Bay Area are held for people who've been in hardship posts, nuclear subs, out of contact with their families for months on end." And so we were trying to figure out where else we were going to go, and we just really felt a tug to be back here and to kind of raise our family here and to live here in Northern California. And, we'd been praying about it, and I finally said, why don't you just call the billet officer, just beg, see what happens. And so he calls the billet officer, and the man says, "A dentist just canceled out at Mountain View 5 minutes ago. The spot is yours." So, I don't know. Was it God's plan for us to be here? I choose to believe so, because it was one of those synchronicities in life that we hadn't anticipated. So, things hadn't gone according to the plan we thought it was going to be in place, but things happened and a different plan evolved. So there's always, when things don't go according to plan, there's always a different path, right? It's Robert Frost's two roads diverged in a narrow wood. Right? There's always another path that can be taken. And although life is not always fair, there is something in us, I believe, as humans that remain committed to justice, to remain committed to not becoming retaliatory or to seek a higher plane. And so, and as Christians, we choose to stay involved in hard places, in places where there is, struggling, where there are places where people are economically disadvantaged, where people don't have food or access to education. Life is unjust, but it doesn't prevent us from ever stepping in with acts of justice, as followers of Christ. Although suffering is a part of life, we have ways of dealing with it, and thereby we expand our powers to handle future pains and help others in pain. I don't know if this has been your experience, but I think when we experience a series of griefs in our life, that somehow or other the emotions, the sense of the grief actually becomes familiar territory. It's terrain we've navigated once or twice in our lives, and if we've come through the other side, it gives us the confidence that we can do that again with God's help. And so pain and suffering never needs to be the end all. It can always be a time of renewal, a time of growth for us. And I don't think we need to look any further than the cross on this, right? The cross, Christ's suffering on the cross led to something far greater. And not that I would ever equate any suffering we might experience as equivalent to that, but that there is always God's presence and grace that may help us to see and create something meaningful and positive out of that suffering. And then although people are not loving and loyal all the time, nothing has to get in the way of our acting with loving kindness towards others and not giving up on others. If others are treating us poorly, it does not mean that we need to treat them poorly. So just some things to remember, as you're meeting with people, in your as caregivers, that there is another side to all of these things that we can't change or think that we can't change, where there is a possibility for some openness or some growth to occur. Let me just pause there. That was like a lot of heavy stuff. So let me just pause and see if there's any questions that you might have on that. Does that seem to resonate? Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jane, everything is fantastic. I love deep and heavy, or if you even want to call it that. This is how I have managed my life, is because I've had deep and heavy, and I know I can do it. And it's thanks to God. He's within me for sure. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate this so much. It's wonderful. Thank you for giving it to us.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah. I just told her, she said, her faith is in her bones, and I just told her if I ever needed a bone marrow transplant, I'm coming to her. Get a little injection of that, along with whatever antibodies you have. All right. Any other comments, questions? All right. So I'm going to ask you to have another conversation around your tables. And on page 20, we're going to talk about, maybe I can just pause. Is there anybody in this room who has never experienced any sort of anticipatory grief whatsoever? Okay, so we'll have enough to talk about. That's what I was wondering. We'll have enough to talk about around the table. So on page 20, what I'd like you to do around your tables, and again, this is because I'm standing up here doing all the blabbering, but there's a lot of wisdom in this room to learn from each other, and telling stories and how people may have shown up in your own life, because I think that's how we actually learn how to show up in other people's lives. So think about a time when you experienced anticipatory grief, ambiguous grief. What was it like for you? Just kind of describe what emotions came up for you. What was that experience like for you? What forms of support did you find helpful? And I guess I should probably add, what kind of support did you not find helpful? I don't, dealing with a mother who's experienced termination of a pregnancy in some way. It's never helpful to say you can always have another child, because the mother is grieving the child that they've lost, right? So there are some very hurtful, unhelpful things we say to each other. And so if you've been in a period of time where somebody has said something to you that was not helpful, feel free to share that as well, because we can all learn even more from that in terms of things that we, were well-intentioned but may not have been received that way. And then is there anything or what helped you to find meaning or goodness or hope in the midst of an uncertain situation? And I hope as people of faith that there is, that there's some good fodder there for you as well to talk about. Okay, so I'm actually gonna give you another half hour to have some pretty robust conversations around the table, answering those questions on page 20, and then we'll come back together. So 11:30, we will regroup. All right, if you would wrap up your conversations, we'll draw back together again. So thank you for sharing your experiences with each other. And as I was just listening to this table, and I was thinking, I actually did have a period of ambiguous grief, which was during the pandemic. Because I mentioned my husband's a dentist. He never stopped working during COVID. And so every night when he came home, my thought was my 14 days of isolation starts over again. Because I was never sure, right, whether he was bringing it home. And so for me, that was my COVID experience was just that, I can protect myself, but I don't know what he's bringing in the house every day. So there was like a lot of ambiguity associated with that. So where I want to go next is on page 21 in your handouts, because I think this is something that probably as Stephen ministers, many of you may be dealing with. But how do you companion someone with a terminal illness? And have any of you read the book by Atul Gawande called Being Mortal? Okay, good. He's a surgeon, a public health professional. His father was also a surgeon, and there was a portion in that book which really spoke to me because his father had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He had a tumor on his spine, which was affecting his hands, and he was a surgeon, so that was his livelihood, was working with his hands. And as part of their conversations together with his physicians, he decided that he really didn't want to go through surgery as soon as they discovered that he had cancer, because his life work was about doing surgery. And so he continued to do surgery for, I think, a couple of years before they even tried to operate on him. But I remember there was a conversation that Atul was having with his father, and it was really this question about, in his later stages of life, what is it that's going to give your life meaning? That's within your capacity to do. And there were two things his dad wanted to do. His dad still wanted to listen to the baseball games on TV. And his dad wanted to meet with med students as long as he could. So med students would come over to his house, and in his last months of life, he was still able to mentor others. And they just kind of decided those were the two things that would give his dad some purpose to get up and meet life every morning. So when you're companioning someone with a terminal illness, there's Randy said, I didn't know you weren't supposed to ask questions as a Stephen minister, and we corrected that around the table. You can ask questions, you just aren't supposed to provide advice, the solution, everything as a Stephen minister. But what I've given you here is a list of questions that you might want to pose to someone who's dealing with a terminal illness, because as we said, one of the greatest gifts you have to someone is just being a companion to them. Susan, can I share your story about what you shared around the table? Is she was a caregiver for her husband, and she had no one to talk to that entire time period. She didn't know Stephen ministry was a thing, and sat at the table and said, I just wish I had somebody that I could have talked through to during this time. So there's a lot of questions you could ask somebody, just in terms of, what worries do you have? What would give meaning to the time that you have left? What would you like to tell your family? What stories do you want to pass along? How would you like to choose, how would you choose to do that? Are there things you want, we hear stories all the time about parents who are leaving letters for their children to read when they turn 21, or for their grandchildren to read. But, what is it that you would like to pass on to your children? What are the stories that only you can tell, about the day your child was born? My younger daughter knows that the day she was supposed to be born and they induced my labor, she was really stubborn and didn't come out. So I was contracting away all day, and they sent me home at the end of the day because she wasn't quite ready to come out of the oven. She knows that story really well because it is, kind of carried on into her personality. But what are the stories, that you would like to tell your children that only, or family members that only you can tell? So I leave you these questions just as, as prompts, right, that you might, pull out and look at if you're a Stephen Minute or somebody who has a terminal illness, or even if you have someone in your own family who's dealing with a terminal illness. Just some questions, because I think even just asking these questions could give meaning to their lives. Yes?
I find the hardest part is sort of permission to broach the subject, because you don't know how the family's handling it, and you don't know whether they want to talk about it or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how do you get over that initial hump? Once you're over and you have permission, these questions are great. But my cousin was dying, and she said that she was dying, and I felt that even as a trained Stephen minister, she was not a believer, and I wanted to respect her beliefs, and I didn't want to bring up a subject that might have made her feel bad. So I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought about it. I still can't decide whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing. How do you cross that barrier?
Yeah, you did what you thought was right in the moment, and, all I can really offer up, and maybe some of you have some thoughts on this, would just be to ask the question, would you be open to talking about this? And just opening that door just to see what the response is, and if the time is not right, to just be able to say, I'm here, right, for a time when and if you choose to talk about it, but just to kind of prop the door open a little bit. Yes.
You're right. What I found worked for me is, especially if you're not talking about minutes, is to open up sort of a conversation, open up a channel of communication that leads to that deep thing that you might want to share, as opposed to just hitting her with it right away. Talk about what do you remember about your life, or what tell me more about what your experiences are, and and then it'll lead through what's important to her or him, and then you can ask that question kind of in a lead-up way that is not, you're dying, tell me right now, I'm exaggerating.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything they would share in response to the question? Okay. This can also be a time that's, an opportunity for spiritual renewal, right? Someone may choose to, look back on their life. They may choose to use this as a time to mend broken relationships. Someone who has, done this to any concept of God throughout their, out their life may suddenly be open to talking about what may happen after we die, or may talk about, the divine God, whatever language they want to put on it. So it can also be a very rich time if people are willing and kind of feel the prompting to go there. So I think, at a time like this, often it is kind of, who am I, right? This illness is not who I am, right? I have this illness, but it doesn't fundamentally change who I am. And so how do I redefine who I am, or what my life looks like, or what my relationships look like? And those are often at the root of the questions for someone who may be dealing with a terminal illness. And as a Stephen minister, again, it's a place where you can, just help to listen to those, and to, perhaps ask some questions that might take someone a little deeper. I often say to people that when I sit with people, for me, it's always trying to listen to the words beneath the words, right? And if there's an indication that somebody's leaving a door open or has some questions that they're struggling with, to be able to just ask that question, or to say, I'm noticing this, may be all they need to get permission to speak about something that's on their mind. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Tim Keller. He's the founding pastor of Redeemer Church, a big church in Manhattan. And he's been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and has started to write about his journey with this. And I think as a pastor and as people of faith, I actually found these words to be somewhat encouraging to me, because what he wrote upon his diagnosis was, he said, one of the first things I learned was that religious faith does not automatically provide solace in times of crisis. Truth in that. A belief in God and an afterlife does not become spontaneously comforting and existentially strengthening. Despite my rational conscious acknowledgement that I would die someday, the shattering reality of a fatal diagnosis provoked a remarkably strong psychological denial of my own mortality. Instead of acting on Dylan's Thomas to rage against the dying of the light, I found myself thinking, what? No, I can't die. That happens to others, but not to me. When I said these outrageous words out loud, I realized that this delusion had been the actual operating principle of my heart. So when the certainty of your mortality and death finally breaks through, is there a way to face it without debilitating fear? Is there a way to spend the time you have left growing into greater grace, love, and wisdom? I believe there is, but it requires both intellectual and emotional engagement. It is both head work and heart work. So these are the things that he decided to pursue as his path, and I just hold this up as, one person's example. He immersed himself in the Psalms to make sure that he wasn't encountering a God he had made up himself. I love that, to find kind of some validation of his own experience in the Psalms of Lament. To address his own soul like a soliloquy, like we read in Psalm 42, why are you cast down, O my soul? Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. To look hard at my deepest trusts, he said, my strongest loves and fears, and bring them into contact with God. And then to pray this prayer daily. As I lay down to sleep and rose this morning, only by your grace, keep me in the joyful, lively remembrance that whatever happens, I will someday know my final rising, because Jesus Christ laid down in death for me and rose for my justification. So in his act of laying down at night, remembering Christ laying down his life, and as he rose in the morning, remembering Christ's resurrection. Another way I heard someone say is that that they had learned to just in the moment say, for this single breath, I give you gratitude. Being able to get to that point is, I think is something we can all hope that we could get there if we're facing circumstances like Tim is. So in kind of in the home stretch here, wanted to talk a little bit about kind of hopelessness and hopefulness, and I'm on page 22. That, again, I think it's important for us to remember signs of hopelessness, which are dread and anxiety and suspicion and apathy. And it usually occurs when we feel totally helpless, that there are no internal resources we can call on, and there are no external resources that we can call on. And so as Stephen ministers, I think we actually help in both of those cases, right? Because we're trying to sit with someone to help them discover what their own internal capacity is, right? What the foundation of their faith may be, what their sense of meaning, what their desires in life are, to get them in touch with some of those internal resources. And around this table, I heard stories of people who have incredibly strong internal resources to help them through. But then the external resources, which is each of you in this room, having people who are willing to show up and to be with people, to be present with people, that the mere act of your showing up helps someone to address whatever sense of hopelessness they may be feeling. And, it may not feel like that as a Stephen minister if you're dealing with someone who is in a really deep state of hopelessness. And it may be a long path through that, but purely by showing up in their lives, you're giving them something to look forward to. Having a date on a calendar, when you say, I'm going to meet with you next week, is something that takes them out of the present and helps them to look forward. So don't ever underestimate just kind of that simple thing of having a time in the future that you're committing to get together with that individual. Things that people might say who are without hope is, that won't work, I can't do that, I don't know where to go from here, that is impossible, there is nothing I can do. And often what we can do is to just kind of help to reframe that. What one small thing are you able to do? Where can you exhibit some agency, right? And it may only be the agency of praying a prayer of desperation to God, but even in that, there is a path out of hopelessness. So on page 23, as Christians, our hope is that God can transform anything into something of meaning. And, the verse in Romans that says, I believe that God can work towards good for all things. It doesn't say God makes all things good, right? That not all things in our life, that we can point to things and say, this is something that is not good. I can say the war that's happening in Gaza and Israel is not good. A child dying, right out of the womb is not good. There is nothing that I could ever say God would ever declare either of those two extreme things good. But what we do as Christians is we have hope that there can be a transformation that comes out of that can work something good in us and through us. And so that is the hope that we have, always the hope that we have. And so how do we, bounce back from life's difficulties through God's grace? On page 23, hope is something that views the future, right? Setting an alarm clock at night is an act of hope. Going to the grocery store is an act of hope. I mean, you laugh, but there are things that simple that someone who's in a hopeless situation, if they can start to do little things like that are forward-looking, can shift their perspective on life. We don't think of it. We think about it, it's just something I do every day. I got to go to the grocery store. We get to go to the grocery store. We get to go to the grocery store and plan what we're going to have for dinner, right? There's hope in that because we're looking for something that's going to happen in the future. So Jeremiah says, there is hope for your future, says the Lord. 1 Corinthians, and now hope, faith, and love abide, these three. And in Romans, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we obtained access to this grace in which we stand. I always have loved that phrase. We stand in grace. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. You are ever looking for a verse to give you hope. Go there. Questions on that? Okay. Another favorite poem of mine, written by Rumi, that deals, I think, with this concept of anticipatory grief or a terminal illness. It's on page 24. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So what I want to do in just our last few minutes is give you, I'm not going to give you just some tools that you could use. So the rest of the pages are just that, some things that you could use for yourself or with a care receiver. First thing on page 25, when you are feeling overwhelmed, the most important thing is to be in the present. I mean, this whole rage about meditation and kind of letting go of things is all about being present in the moment. And, anticipatory grief gets us thinking and ruminating about the future, right? It gets us thinking about things that could be but may never be. And whenever we find ourselves doing that, a really simple practice, and I'm facilitating a support group here at church for people who've been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, and they have found this to be extremely helpful. And we start our gatherings sometimes with this, is to just close your eyes. And I'm just going to ask you to do this right now. We'll just do it all together. Just close your eyes and bring your thoughts into the center, letting go of any distractions, and maybe just taking a couple of deep breaths. And then just think of 5 things here in this room that you can see or hear or feel. Could be the buzzing in the microphone, it could be your feet on the floor, but just think of 5 things that are currently part of your environment and list them in your mind. And then use your senses to think about what you feel. The room is warm or cold. The floor is hard. I can feel my breath. I can hear the person breathing next to me. And then take a couple more breaths. And realize that in this present moment, nothing you have anticipated has happened. In this present moment, you are okay. And you can open your eyes again. Good. Real simple exercise just to help someone work through something that they might be anxious about, and good as a daily practice. Some other daily practices. Gratitude is a spiritual discipline. Again, when we express gratitude, something happens to the serotonin or the happy hormone in our bodies that actually lifts our spirits. There's like literal physiological changes that happen when we express gratitude. And it could be just spending 2 minutes every day listing some things that we're grateful for. It could be a 30-day practice of, each night before you go to bed, listing 5 things that happened during the day that you're grateful for. And over that time, just something as simple as that can change our perspective and offering those things up in gratitude to God. You're all familiar with the Serenity Prayer on page 27. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. We listed the 5 of them earlier. Life is not fair. Bad things happen. And the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so just some questions. With God's grace and serenity, I accept these things that I cannot change, listing those. With God's grace and my courage, I admit that I can have some agency, and I can change these things. And with God's grace, wisdom will help me to discern whether I cannot change these things or whether I can change these things. But even going through an exercise of what are the things that I need to let go of because I can't control them, and what things do I actually have some agency over. Page 28 is a self-compassion break. Just a real simple way of going through and just opening your time up to be compassionate to yourself. And again, something that might be helpful as you're working with someone that, we can be kind to ourselves. If no one else in the world is being kind to us, we can still be kind to ourselves and open ourselves up to God's loving kindness. And I won't go into that in great detail either. And then on page 29, something that might jog some conversation pieces if you're working with someone who's kind of seems to be coming out the backside of dealing with some grief, to just help them to do some reflection on what that experience has been like that. Hey, are there ways in which you've learned to look at things in a more positive way? Have you learned that you're actually stronger than you thought you were? Are there ways in which your life has more meaning and satisfaction? Just some tips for some conversations that you might put out there for people to reflect on to help them gauge, their progress. Because sometimes we feel stuck, and to just be able to have a time of reflection saying, yes, I now know something about myself. I now know something about another person. I now know something about God that I did not know before. And having them verbalize that may help to cement that further for them.
I think that could be used very well towards the end of a Stephen ministry care receiver relationship. where you're affirming, look where you've come, and be able to mention some of these.
That's a beautiful add-on. Thank you. Thank you. All right, y'all got that? Last meeting with, she said it's what's on page 29 could be very helpful with someone at the end of a Stephen ministry relationship, because you could actually talk through this with your care receiver and see how much growth has occurred, or how, what has transpired during your time. Because obviously if you're getting to the end, things are probably in a place of a resolution, or they're ready to move on. Great idea. Thank you for that. All right, so I'm going to, being with someone who grieves really is being a witness to their grief. It's being present with them. It's listening to them. And it's listening, as you all know as Stephen ministers, it's listening to care and to respond and to understand, but not to fix, right? We leave the fixing up to God. It's not, I love this phrase, it's knocking gently on someone's heart, but not barging in. Sometimes words are not even needed. Being cared for by others is often enough. I don't know what each of your individual I had a spiritual director I was seeing who, at a time when I was struggling, who was a Quaker, and I would show up in her office, and sometimes I would sit with her for a solid hour, and neither of us would say a thing, and I felt a lot better when I was done, because I was spending the time in prayer. I knew she was holding me in prayer. Words are not necessarily what's needed. It is just your presence that is always, always the most important thing. And you can always say, I don't know what this is like for you, but I am here with you, right? Because I think that's really the essence of being a Stephen minister. And I just want to say thank you to all of you who serve in that capacity, for your care for others, for your love for others, and being willing to go perhaps places you've never been before, with people who have never gone to the places they're experiencing as well, but being willing to be co-journeyers with them, and to share the grace of God and the love of God through your presence. So thank you all for the work that you do. So I'm going to close with yet one more thing. Page 30, Rainer Maria Rilke, another one of my favorite poets. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, and then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing and embody me. Flare up like flame. Love that. Pentecost is coming. Flare up like flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. God speaks to each of us that way. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Jane.
You are welcome. It's been my privilege to be here with you all today. Thank you.